Welcome to the Excellence at Work podcast, where we explore the strategies and best practices that drive business success. I'm Rachel Cook, COO of Brandon Hall Group and the host of our podcast, along with members of our executive team. In each episode, we'll dive into the latest trends, insights, and real-world examples from some of the most exciting leaders from organizations worldwide. Be part of our journey and learn from the best as we discuss innovative approaches and cutting-edge technologies for talent management, learning and development, leadership, diversity and inclusion, and more.
Hi, everyone. This is Michael Rochelle, Chief Strategy Officer, Principal Analyst here at the Brandon Hall Group, bringing to you another Excellence at Work podcast. And I have one of my favorite people on to talk about what's going on out there. Just recently attended Explorance World that was held here in Boston, Massachusetts at Boston University. Great venue. We had some great weather, which was nice. We had some great dialogue, great discussion. And one of the things that was super intriguing, I'm glad Steve's here, is he brought up this really interesting idea now of how things need to be looked at differently when it comes to learning measurement. The idea being that measurement needs to be evidence-based for driving this L&D value curve, which I just found extremely intriguing in this presentation. So Steve, maybe you can introduce yourself, and I can't wait to try to recap, recreate the energy that we had at the conference when you did your keynote.
Thank you. My name is Steve Lange. I'm the General Manager of the Metrics That Matter business unit at Explorance. Metrics That Matter has been around for 20 years, helping L&D show and prove the value of learning effectiveness and impact with their organization. My entire background was learning development. I spent 25 years as an instructional designer and learning manager. The last 12 years have been focusing on measurement and evaluation. Full transparency, I was a client of MTM back when I ran learning measurement and evaluation at McDonald's Hamburger University. So I made the jump to the other side of the desk, so to speak.
Well, thanks, Steve, for being on, and let's jump into it. So what inspired you to create the L&D value curve, and what problem in the learning industry were you trying to solve?
Yeah, maybe not so much of a problem, more of just the reality of that learning organizations today are under pressure to do a lot more than just deliver training. They're being asked to improve performance, which you yourself, Michael, have said it's, the outcome isn't learning, it is performance. So they're being asked to do that more and more. Build critical capabilities, so focusing on skills, but they're also being asked to do things like support business transformation, improve where learning investments can create value for the organization. So the challenge then is where and how does measurement play a role in that? The other challenge is that most teams in learning and development, they don't have unlimited time, budget, or analytics resources. So, the goal is not to create a larger measurement function, and we don't really think about maturity as simply getting better at measurement. The goal is to use the right evidence at the right moments to help L&D make better decisions on what they're going to invest in and how they're becoming more useful to the business. So while measurement plays a critical role in this, it only does it when it helps teams make these better decisions. What to improve, what to scale, what do we stop doing? How often do you see that happening in learning development? Where do managers need to help reinforce learning? And most importantly, how is learning connected to business priorities? So that's kind of where the value curve comes in. It's not about making measurement the journey, but it's part of that evidence layer of helping L&D really become that trusted business advisor and really help the business plan where they're going to invest in talent and learning development.
Mm-hmm. And was there like a client engagement or a particular moment where all of a sudden, you had the epiphany and realized that this framework was needed?
Not really a moment. It's been the last 3 years, watching L&D groups get smaller and seeing how the real dedicated measurement leads, like when I was a client, like when I was talking about that McDonald's, right? That was my whole role. That was my job. And it's not happening anymore. Especially in the last 2 years, there's been this renewed push for L&D to become stronger partner to the business, becoming that true advisor or consultant to helping the business solve problems through learning and performance initiatives. You and I were talking at the conference, Michael, about how performance improvement consulting, that was really big in the late 90s and early aughts, and how we kind of feel like that needs to come back and that is coming back. So And the part of the heart of that is being able to demonstrate the value and connect to outcomes that learning is helping the business achieve. So we're really just trying to help learning do more with what they have today without having to create all these new specialty roles or groups within groups.
Yeah, so let's dig a little bit deeper into the curve. So it kind of shows for people out there visualizers like this progression, right? From measuring training delivery, left-hand side, all the way over to influencing workforce intelligence. And you had stages, I remember, and there were 6 or 7 boxes that you have to go on a journey. But one of the things that we talked about was why do so many organizations get stuck in the first 2 or 3
Right. So yeah, those first stages are about training delivery and learning effectiveness. So it's kind of the low hanging fruit. It's probably where most people fall today. They had to kind of put themselves on this curve. But what typically happens at this point is whatever success has been deemed good enough, and then the organization moves on. So they get to that point where they've made a little bit of progress, and then the next bright and shiny thing kind of shows up, right? Or reorganization happens, or maybe a team was put in place to focus on measurement for a bit. They created some things and then they disband, someone gets promoted. And what really happens is accountability fades, right? There's no one to turn around and say, well, who's really responsible for this? Who's accountable for this? So the speed and pace of change, while always increasing, it's almost always present. Therefore, it kind of makes it easier to pivot away towards that next great thing or something else that just, attracts attention, like AI, for instance.
It's intriguing points, and I think a lot of the audience wants to know too is for themselves, like what's the biggest mindset shift that they have to go through in order to achieve this? Like what changes right away for them?
I'm going to go back to it's really constantly thinking in terms of performance and performance that's linked to outcomes. Or, I kind of couch it with a lot of our clients. I call it kind of the so what, now what phase. When you're collecting nothing but activity and completion, right? So you say, oh yeah, we trained 53,000 people. It was 10,000 hours of training and, we had an NPS score of 65. But then I ask, okay, but then what happens when someone says, so what? And there's no answer there because you don't have any other, evidence or data that you've been collecting. But when you start combining those things like activity metrics with what we call efficiency and outcome metrics, so it's not just what you did, but how you did it. Did you do it with the right people? Were there, how much did it cost? How much did you save? And then linking those to some of the business outcomes and outcome metrics, then you can start answering real business questions and start demonstrating impact. But you have to have that mindset of performance linked to outcomes because, again, we're trying to improve people's performance so that the business itself can improve and meet its business goals. So that's that mindset shift. It's not training delivery and activity. We got to go think all the way through to the output.
Yeah, and I think kind of segueing, one of the most interesting transitions on the curve was exactly what you were getting at, from performance enhancement to business alignment, which is a pretty lofty goal. What does that shift look like in practice? Like how do organizations move from like individual, even team performance to driving business alignment?
Well, this is where we start to talk about when people, have a seat at the table, meaning whether it's the CLO or whoever, when you're sitting down and starting to actually have input to business planning or strategic priorities, certain things that you're trying to influence with learning and development and talent and performance. So this is when the work of what L&D is doing, you're connecting that to business outcomes and decision making. This is where we start bringing in our evidence layer with application data and outcome data so that leaders can see where learning is actually reaching people, where it's improving capability, where it's changing behavior, and most importantly too is where should the investments be shifted to create the greatest impact. It's more about, we can think about, if we pull this lever, are we going to get the most impact, or should we pull this lever and get impact over here? So it's about being able to have those conversations and not just be staring at a blank wall. We can bring some data to the table to help really align what learning development should be doing in helping the business. So we start becoming a little bit more proactive versus reactive.
Any organizations come to mind that you can share that have successfully made this transition?
Yeah, I'll not use the name to protect the innocent, but we had a client and they had a leadership development program. They called it growing effective leaders, and they called it gel, right? Because they had a lot of cool slogans around gel. But the big goals, the thing is they sat down and like, what problems are we trying to solve with leadership development? That's one of the things that stalls these programs is they're not connected to actual business problems. It's like, oh, well, we need to increase people's trust, or we need to increase people's ability to build teams and do these things. But it's always like, okay, but what's the so what? Right? What's the so what now what? So their goals were pretty clear. It was, one is they wanted to create a pipeline of internal talent. So they wanted to increase their bench strength, right? They wanted to be able to, at a certain level, people wanted to be able to look behind them and say, all right, who's next? Without going to the outside, right? So they wanted to increase the likelihood that folks at a certain level would move up. They'd be able to fill these roles from an internal pipeline, because we all know it's more cost effective, it's faster, it keeps that culture thing in place. So they wanted to really avoid having to constantly, while going outside is good for some things, right? You want an infusion of new blood. At some point, though, they really wanted to make that, I'll call it the talent ladder. They wanted to build it up more. So of course they showed activity metrics, how many people were attending, what the costs were. They had great learning effectiveness scores. They did pre and post things that they were tracking, but then they also were tracking things like turnover of external hires versus the GEL participants. They were looking at tenure length. So people that were promoted through GEL versus those that came in from the outside, how long were they staying? They also looked at just internal movement. So, in the last few years, Michael, it's not so much are you moving up, but can you move across the organization? Because where your skills are useful here, they might be useful over here too. Or there might be some really interesting projects that are going on over there, and you're like, well, it's not a promotion, but gosh, that's really cool. I want to be over there and working on that. So they showed those type of stats. They worked with the talent organization to pull in that data alongside the program, and they did that intentionally, though. It wasn't like, oh, maybe we should do this. That was part of the design. That was part of that. What outcomes are we trying to achieve? It helps answer the question that I'm always asking, which is, what does success look like, and then how will we know? But they showed people getting promoted or moved in the company. People coming out of GEL. They outpaced the outside folks 10-1. They were so successful with the program that they actually decided to increase the scope to that next level down. So they were focused more like on, the senior managers and directors, but they were like, hey, if it's working up here, let's build the talent pipeline even further down and make it more accessible so that we're actually building talent sooner in the kind of the life cycle of the employee. So they did that. They had more offerings, and it was not just strengthening the bench, but that whole ladder was getting stronger because they had a more stable platform. So that's just really the classic case. And it wasn't a giant tank full of data. They weren't just making guesses. They weren't just looking at spreadsheets and trying to find the value. It was all done up front because they were focused on performance and outcomes.
Yeah, it's interesting how the way you describe it, and you did this at the conference in your keynote too, it sounds straightforward. I think that's what's exciting about it, is we're not making this a difficult or complex journey. It's literally, as you pointed out, you just take these incremental steps and climb your way up the L&D value curve without any predetermined time periods or saying that there has to be heavy lifting at every step. But what I like about what you're saying too is there's this guiding principle that we have to move away from learning in and of itself being the end point. Like, it's not about hours of training delivered and completed or grades, or we have to be in the show. L&D contributes to individual team and organizational performance, align with business strategy, can drive real things and show like a real return on investment in learning itself. Kind of playing off of that, like the one that was at the very top of the L&D value curve was this idea of, workforce intelligence, which really caught my attention because that's really where it's all about, creating greater insights for the organization itself. So this is where I think you made a really interesting point, where learning becomes more predictive and strategic. So we're not just reading the newspaper to someone or reporting on what's already happened, but we're beginning to say, how can learning move the needle looking forward and what strategic value drivers come?
Right.
So the question I have for you is, how close are most organizations to achieving that today? And how does AI play into that as an accelerator?
I'm not sure how close most organizations are. I think they're closer than they have been in the past. I'll use skills as an example. It's been it's the whole skills topic of reskilling and upskilling. It's been and remains, it's such an important and hot topic over the last few years. But to me, this is an example of workforce intelligence because, companies they're looking at, what are the most important jobs to be done in an organization, right? We know how our company makes money. What are the most important jobs to be done in the organization? And then it's, okay, what are the skills that we need that are behind those jobs? And then and here's where the workforce intelligence capability comes in. It's, where are we lacking those skills? Where are the gaps? Where do they lie in the organization or within roles or jobs? And then what do we need to do to actually implement those reskilling and upskilling? And it goes back to, like, is it, what levers do we pull? Because is it this part of the organization? Is it that part of the organization? Is it this role, or is it this role? There's the axiom of, a company gets, 80% of its lift from 20% of the population. I mean, it's kind of like, where do we really want to invest? Because you could list 50 skills, right, that we need to focus on, but realistically, is L&D really going to be able to support that? Probably not. So, can we get that list to 20 or 10 or 15, somewhere there? And that, that takes a lot of intelligence. That takes a lot of being able to predict and look at where are we gonna make our bets, right? Companies do this all the time when it comes to marketing or sales strategies, right? They're focusing on a slice of the market or a certain feature or functionality of a product or whatever, and they're making those decisions, based on their own market intelligence and who they're selling to and what they're selling. So in a way, that's what we want L&D to be able to do with the business, be able to say, hey, we know what the capability needs are. Here's what we're offering. Here's what we're suggesting. Based on what we know about folks and what we have to develop them, here's where we think we can get to in the next 2 to 3 years. That'll help either plug a capability or a gap, or maybe increase one, because those are the ones that are going to push the business the furthest. So let's stop focusing down here so much all the time, and really lift ourselves up and get to what those critical roles and skills are, and really dig in, because again, that's where you want to be spending your investment, your time, and your resources. Not these lower level programs, but more like what's really going to get us the most lift.
So when we're thinking through that, what capabilities or technologies are going to separate leaders from everyone else over the next, say, 5 years? Like, what does that look like?
Obviously, AI helps that, but I don't think it's necessarily like agentic AI, where you're just going to ask a question and it's going to provide you all the answers. I still think we as the humans in human performance improvement, we still need to make sure we're defining what we need with the right questions, and then linking those decisions to the business outcome. You have to have obviously some really good tools that you trust and that you depend on. I'm not a huge believer in the one tool to solve them all, right? I don't think there's necessarily one tool that you can say you're gonna get everything you need all the time, but it's more about choosing the right ones that are going to get you the best. I call them the best links in the chain of evidence. Right? You got you got to go from here to here. So where can I get really the best evidence, and can I blend that together? Now there's a case for AI, right? It doesn't necessarily have to drive your strategy, but it should be enabling it. It goes back to, people used to always talk about, well, we're data driven. We're data driven. Like, well, I don't want you to be data driven. I want you to be data enabled, because data doesn't make decisions, people do. And you still need to be involved in that process. So I think, something that I've seen some companies focusing on, especially because AI is sort of taking some of the heavy lifting off of our brains almost too much. So it's about, well, how do we maintain things like critical thinking, so that we're not just taking the first thing AI throws at us and implementing it, but how do we use it conversationally to challenge our own thinking, so that we can open up what we're really trying to do. And I don't know if you've seen that with clients that you work with, Michael. I don't know. Do you see them kind of leaning into AI too much, or are they keeping it at bay? How are they kind of using it to make decisions around business outcomes?
It's interesting you bring that up. What I liked about what you just said, Steve, is that the success that you're proffering here that a company could achieve is agnostic to AI. There's still some general strong principles there. I mean, certainly AI could potentially be an accelerator or, a multiplier, but what I like is you're saying is that this is good, old-fashioned, solid idea of get in there and just rethink. Like we talked about at the conference, people normally don't have a measurement problem. They have a learning problem. And I think you're bringing up the idea that we have all of this in control. AI can, potentially, be a companion with that, but changing the way we think about designing learning, having it build towards not learning in and of itself, but performance, workforce intelligence, how measurement becomes a catalyst, all these different things. I love all of that. And I think it makes it very reachable, very attainable for the people that are listening to the podcast and the people that were at the conference. And so it also too, I like the way you're positioned, because if people aren't ready to put a lot of time and effort into AI, they can still achieve this in partnering with you. You had a very telling ending to the last slide that you showed. I just want to read the quote. Measurement is not the journey, it's the evidence system that helps L&D move up the value curve. So what do you hope that every L&D leader takes away from that idea?
I think first and foremost, what I'm not saying is, the goal is not to abandon operational measurement, right? It's really, again, it's to use those different layers or those different links in the chain to support increasingly strategic decisions. The curve starts with proving delivery and quality, because you still have to deliver stuff and prove that there's quality happening. But then it's like, okay, let's not stop there. We want to expand into application and show how application can help us align better with the business. And then how can we decide really where to invest, what to invest, what do we want to scale up, what do we want to stop doing, which I always love doing. Like, okay, I can do all this stuff. What do you want me to stop doing? Don't stop doing anything. Okay, well, you got to have some trade-offs there. So it's, again, and like you were saying, each step adds a stronger evidence layer. And sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down. It's just a matter of starting somewhere. The curve ultimately, it connects L&D work to business decision making. Leaders can see where learning is reaching people, where it's improving capability, and where investment should be shifted to create the greatest impact. And that's really what it's about. It's about having that focus and scope of what do we want to do, but also what aren't we going to do, and the reasoning behind both. Right? You can't just say, well, we're going to stop doing that. You got to have you got to have some intelligence to say, well, we've been offering this class for 10 years, only 50 people come to it a year, and it costs us $3,000 a class. Why do you keep offering that, right? It's okay to say no to some of those things.
Yeah, and I think what you're also bringing up too that I think is super important is we can't take anything for granted. If we're going to rethink this, we have to have the courage, right, to be able to say everything's on the table. There's nothing that's off the table. We have to look at everything and look at it through a different lens in order to achieve this. And this time around, we have to look at it through the lens of how are we impacting the business? How are we making the business better? And don't you think that that's going to, just to riff on this for a second, don't you think that this is going to help L&D leaders to be able to have better conversations with their business stakeholders, their business colleagues as well?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a saying at Explorance. In fact, I think might have been the theme of Explorance World a year or two ago, but it's data for the brave. You have to be brave enough to look at your own data and not fall in love with your own products and services and stuff. You want to fall in love with your customers, which L&D, those are your business stakeholders. Those are the people that are actually doing the job. So yeah, you absolutely have to have that shift of, all right, I'm going to be critical of our own data and stuff and ask the hard questions.
So we're at that time that we always put our experts on the spot. So here we go. Is if you gave one thing out to the audience of what people should do right away after hearing this podcast, watching this podcast, about beginning on this journey of changing the way they look at learning measurement within their organization, what's that one thing?
I think with As you establish relationships with your stakeholders, start with business problems or decisions that they need to make and improve. Start with those. What are they accountable for? What are they trying to achieve? And then define, okay, how, where, when, and why can L&D play a role to focus on helping you solve that business problem? Because as we know, sometimes L&D can, sometimes it can't. But again, it comes down to my favorite quote, which I'll just say again, is what does success look like, and how will you know? Because if you can't describe those things, then it's really tough for L&D to try to back into it and show true impact and value.
Well said. And adding to that too, how do you, just kind of a quick follow jump to, you can help organizations too to figure out where they already are. It's like not everyone is at the starting gate. There's a lot, but you can kind of GPS, do a pin drop into where people are and then move them incrementally, right?
Absolutely. We always tell people when they're starting out on more formal, learning measurement and evaluation is to start somewhere. Put your foot on the ground and start somewhere. You don't have to measure everything all at once or even all the time, right? Start with something, again, find that friendly stakeholder. How can L&D help you solve a business problem? Okay, yes. It's training? Cool. Well, what does success look like? If we do training, what are you expecting training to change? I sometimes I'll ask stakeholders like, first of all, how do you know something's broken? Do you have a KPI or a goal or something already in place that you can point to and say, this is how I know this is broken? Because if you can't, then how can I show you something that's fixed? And it's not about, you're not being obnoxious. You're just asking true questions. Because if you're asking me to help you solve a problem and I'm committing to that, I'm also asking you, what's the proof going to be that I can show you that we did our job as your L&D business partner?
Yeah, that's super important, and a good place to begin to wrap up on is the idea that there is partnerships that have to be created within the organization to make this work. I'm sure there's some people in the audience listening to us saying, man, this feels a lot like it's all on me. But those stakeholders that you have to address in terms of business outcome also should be your partners on this journey, right? It's working together with them so that they agree on the outcomes, they agree on what the benefits look like, and then they become really advocates for you, right? That if mission accomplished, they're going to go in there and say, hey, we couldn't have done it without learning, wouldn't have been able to achieve these outcomes without learning. So it gets back to what you said. That's the strategic part of it. This isn't just reinventing measurement, but how to L&D's value curve isn't driven by the measurement. It's driven by what's the overall strategic contribution that L&D is making, which should be pretty enlightening, pretty exciting to people to hear that they have a shot at this.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head.
Well, we appreciate you joining us. And again, Explorance World was amazing. I mean, interactions, your keynote, a lot of great information. I strongly suggest everyone to reach out to you directly, Steve. We'll make sure that we plot something there so if people want to get a chance to go through the L&D value curve with you directly. I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have with Explorance to really understand the depth and breadth and visualize it. So we appreciate you coming on board, and it'll be interesting to see how the world unfolds as we start to get to, believe it or not, the second half of 2026, where we'll see what all of this brings. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure talking with you on all things measurement and learning.
It is. And again, this is Michael Rochelle, Chief Strategy Officer, Principal Analyst here at the Brandon Hall Group. Thank you for joining us.